Now, as the name of the video implies, this is the third part of a story, so if you haven't seen the first two parts, I'd highly recommend checking them out first, and if you like them, coming back for this part. I'll include a link to both of those in the description below. And now, without further ado, let's get back to the story. We again find ourselves on Mandalore, and with Obi-Wan Kenobi, who still sits at the edge of his bed, only now there is a small wooden box in his lap, the one given to him by Satine on their wedding day. And with an almost nervous look on his burnt and blistering face, we watch as he slowly lifts the lid. And the look on his face when he sees what's inside quickly becomes one of confusion. We're then looking over Obi-Wan's shoulder and see that in the box is a mask. And as Obi-Wan reaches into the box and removes it, he utters one word, Revan. That's when he sets the box aside and again looks at his reflection in the mirror, at the horrible damage the fire has done to his face, and then looks back down at the mask he now clutches in both hands and slowly brings it up to his face and puts it on. And as soon as he does, there is a jarring flash of light, and we see a rapid series of hazy images, most of which are impossible to discern. But among them, we can make out a warrior with a blue lightsaber fighting amidst an army of Mandalorians, before we then see what appears to be a Sith Lord wielding a crimson-bladed saber, and then a dark-haired woman wielding a double-bladed yellow saber. Next, we see a small, lush green island, and then we're on that island and see Obi-Wan wielding a red lightsaber, fighting alongside two dark figures also wielding red sabers. Their identities, however, are too difficult to make out, but the three opponents they face, those we can see all too clearly, and they are Qui-Gon Jinn, Count Dooku, and Anakin Skywalker, who looks several years older than the 12-year-old boy we know him to be at this point of the story. That image then swirls and morphs into another, and this time we see Obi-Wan putting on Revan's mask before igniting a saber with a black blade and lifting it over his head triumphantly, as a massive crowd of Mandalorian warriors who surrounds him begins to cheer wildly. Some even ignite blue and green lightsabers and raise them over their heads in victory, and that's when we see that among them are the bodies of many dead Jedi. And as we watch this, we hear Satine's voice say, I foresee you being a great leader of Mandalore. There is then another jarring flash, and we're back with Obi-Wan in the present, who is breathing heavily and has now removed the mask and stares down at it with wide, horror-filled eyes. When he finally glances up from it, he sees that there are now 3 armed Mandalorian warriors in his room, all wearing blue and gray armor, and one stands directly over him. Before Obi-Wan can even react, the Mandalorian draws back his rifle and hits Obi-Wan in the face with the butt of it, knocking him out. We then switch scenes and get a shot of the planet Coruscant before we're taken down to the city level and focus in on a massive skyscraper, and as we draw ever closer to it, we soon see Padme Amidala upon a balcony, and standing next to her is Qui-Gon Jinn. We then hear Padme say, You do realize how much I'm risking by letting you stay here? Qui-Gon gives a very appreciative nod of the head and replies, I do, Senator, and we will not stay long, you have my word. Padme then looks over her shoulder, back into her apartment where we can see Anakin sitting upon a sofa with his head lowered. Padme then comments, I feel terrible for him. He's the most wanted being in the galaxy right now. She then looks at Qui-Gon and continues, Do you really think the Mandalorians will kill him if they get their hands on him? Qui-Gon nods. There is little doubt of it. Padme then frowns and replies, And if they don't, do you really think they'll go to war over this incident? A war with the Republic? Qui-Gon sighs and seems to not want to answer, but eventually he does and says, Satine may not have been the target of this assassination attempt, but it was still her life that was lost. The Mandalorians will not sit back and allow such a thing to go unavenged. They will see it as being weak. Padme gives a slight roll of the eyes. How insane. To avenge the death of a pacifist, they'll go to war. She then lets out a soft sigh before she again looks inside the apartment at the forlorn Anakin, and that's when Qui-Gon says, I know what you're thinking. You care a great deal about him, but you're wondering if one boy is worth starting a war over. Padme shuts her eyes and lowers her head. I hate to admit it, but yes, that's something I am asking myself, something that must be asked. Qui-Gon nods and then says, You must trust me on this. Even if it does come to war, what Anakin may one day prevent would be far worse. We're then inside Padme's apartment, and with Anakin, who still sits upon the sofa with his head lowered and his gaze focused on the floor at his feet. We then watch as Count Dooku approaches him and stops right above him. He briefly looks at Qui-Gon and Padme talking on the balcony before he looks down at Anakin and says, "All of this is not your fault, young one." To that, Anakin gives a slight shrug and doesn't look up, but rather mutters something about how it feels like his fault, and maybe it would be best if they just handed him over to the Mandalorians. Dooku then says, "Qui-Gon would never allow that to happen. He believes you to be the chosen one, though I'm curious to know what you believe." Again, Anakin just gives a slight shrug and says, "I just want to be a Jedi. I don't care about all this chosen one stuff." Dooku then says, "I know how you feel, for when I was your age, I was called the Promised One." To that, Anakin finally stops staring at the floor and looks up at Dooku and asks, "Why were you called that? Were you supposed to fulfill some prophecy too?" Dooku grins and takes a seat next to Anakin on the sofa before saying, "In a way, I suppose. You see, Anakin, when I was your age, Master Yoda selected me to be his Padawan." Anakin looks nothing but confused and says, "But I thought Master Yoda didn't take on Padawans, that he focused only on training younglings and leading the council." Dooku nods. "Such is his way now, and had been for hundreds of years before he selected me." Anakin then asks, "So why did he make an exception for you?" Dooku gives a bit of a shrug and says, "Though he never said it, most assumed he had selected me to succeed him as Master of the Council someday, and because of this, I was called the Promised One, promised to one day lead the Jedi." Anakin thinks for a moment and says, "But Master Yoda is still head of the Council, and you're old," Dooku finishes for him. "Yes, much more of my life is now behind me than ahead of me, and Master Yoda has given no indication of a desire to step down from his position." He then locks eyes with Anakin and Dooku says, "And what do you think all that means?" Anakin thinks for a long moment and then says that Yoda either changed his mind or you were never the Promised One. You were just believed to be, and that maybe he trained you personally for another reason yet unknown to you. Dooku nods and grins as if impressed by Anakin's deduction skills and says, "Just like you may or may not be the chosen one. Either way, my young friend, you must let the Force guide you, something most of the Jedi seem to have forgotten." Anakin's face wrinkles in confusion and he asks, "What do you mean forgotten?" Dooku quickly glances at Qui-Gon and Padme, who are still on the balcony, and then says to Anakin in a much quieter voice, "Like Qui-Gon, I too feel a shadow and a threat looming over the Jedi, but unlike him, I have gone in search of its origin." Anakin, looking very intrigued, then asks, "And have you found it?" Dooku shakes his head, but before he can say more, both Qui-Gon and Padme re-enter the apartment. Both Dooku and Anakin then get to their feet as Padme says, "You may all stay here as long as you need to." Dooku nods, but then says, "Your offer is appreciated, Senator, but for all we know, your security detail has already alerted the Republic that we're here." Padme shakes her head and even looks a bit angry at the accusation as she says, "Each member of my security detail is loyal to me and me alone. I trust all of them with my very life. Besides, other than maybe Nute Gunray, who they all hate as much as I do, I can't imagine I've made any enemies they'd be willing to betray me to." We then immediately switch scenes and get a shot of Palpatine as he stands in his office looking out a large window at the never-ending city beyond. And in the reflection of the glass, we can just make out that standing behind him are several Jedi, including Yoda, Mace Windu, Ki-Adi-Mundi, among others. Palpatine then says to the Jedi, not turning around to face them, "So, what you're telling me is that you have no idea where these 3 Jedi renegades even are." We then focus in on Yoda, who makes a bit of an angry face before saying, "Renegades they are not. Doing what they feel is right, Dooku and Qui-Gon are." Palpatine rolls his eyes and turns to face the Jedi, and with an almost smug look says, "And these renegades think risking a war with Mandalore is the right thing?" Mace Windu then speaks up. Qui-Gon believes his Padawan to be the chosen one that an ancient Jedi prophecy speaks of. Briefly, Palpatine looks ever so intrigued to hear that, but the look quickly vanishes and he says, "I care not how highly Master Qui-Gon thinks of his Padawan. I want all 3 of them apprehended and returned to Coruscant to face justice." Windu gives a tight-lipped frown, as if there's something he wants to say, but instead just says, "They may still be on Coruscant. We thought they had stolen a shuttle from the Jedi Temple, but when we caught up to it, we found it abandoned and it was just on autopilot. Most likely, they used it as a decoy." Palpatine then says, Master Yoda, was Count Dooku not a Padawan of yours? I may not know much about the Jedi, but I thought there always existed a bond between master and apprentice. Can you not sense where he is? Yoda shuts his eyes tightly for a moment and says, Tried I have. Powerful with the Force, my old apprentice is. See him through it. I cannot. Palpatine then shakes his head and sighs. There could not be a worse time for trouble to start with Mandalore, he says. What with this separatist movement forming, and so many systems threatening to align and leave the Republic. Just then, Mas Amedda enters the room, goes up to Palpatine, and whispers something in his ear. Palpatine nods and then says to the Jedi, You'll have to forgive me, Masters, but another matter requires my attention. I implore you one last time. Find these Jedi renegades and bring them to justice by any means necessary. After Yoda and Windu exchange a quick look of what appears to be surprise and disbelief, they, along with the rest of the Jedi, file out of Palpatine's office, and once gone, Palpatine immediately says to Mas Amedda, Are we certain this information is accurate? Mas Amedda nods and says, Your informant within Senator Amidala's security detail claims all 3 Jedi are currently there. Palpatine smiles. Good. This may work to our advantage. Mas Amedda nods in agreement and says, Should I alert Republic security forces to move in and apprehend them? Once in custody, we can turn them over to the Mandalorians and put an end to this crisis. Palpatine gives a small, evil grin and says, No. Use your back channels to alert the Mandalorians as to where the boy is. Mas Amedda looks stunned. But the Mandalorians will not hesitate to go in and apprehend the boy themselves, and them launching an attack on a senator's apartment will only make this situation worse. Palpatine snaps back, Yes, I know. Mas Amedda, looking more confused than ever, then says, But if they do attack the home of a senator, such an action may be seen by the Republic as the first act of a war I was under the impression we are not ready for, what with the first batch of clones still years away from completion. Besides, it was supposed to be this separatist movement that became the enemies of the Republic, a faction you were supposed to be able to control through a carefully selected figurehead. Palpatine snarls and seems to say, mostly to himself, Thanks to Maul's betrayal, the one I had desired to lead my armies never fell to the dark side, but I have foreseen I shall soon have a new apprentice, one destined to lead Mandalore, though he may not believe himself capable of it quite yet. Mas Amedda lets out a sigh and says, This way, dealing with the Mandalorians, seems much riskier. Palpatine again snarls. Perhaps, but I believe there may be another force at work here, one who thinks the involvement of the Mandalorians will sabotage my plans. I originally mistook Maul's betrayal of me as cowardice, but I believe someone did tell him not to engage those Jedi, someone who understood my plans all too well. Mas Amedda looks completely taken aback and truly afraid as he says, Surely you don't think I had anything to do with it. Palpatine lets out a brief, cackling laugh before saying, No, you are too much of a coward to ever consider betraying me, nor do you fully grasp what it is I hope to accomplish. Palpatine walks to the window and looks out upon the city once more. He is quiet for some time, and there is the slightest hint of fear on his face as he says, I fear my old master may yet live. We then switch scenes, and we see an unconscious Obi-Wan, his hands tied or cuffed behind his back, sitting against a large crate in the cargo bay of what appears to be a small ship. Slowly then, we watch his eyes open, and we hear him groan in pain as we notice a large, fresh bruise on his already burnt face. We then see that, leaning casually against another crate not far from him, is a Mandalorian in blue and gray armor holding a rifle, which he holds up and says, I think I made an improvement to that hideous face of yours. Obi-Wan winces in pain before saying, Why don't you just kill me already? Isn't that what you wanted to do in the first place? The Mandalorian then shrugs. I'm only following orders, and those orders say to keep you alive. Besides, can't say I'm upset that that rocket hit Satine instead of you. She deserved to die for betraying her people and trying to change our ways. To that, Obi-Wan surprisingly just smiles before saying, Do you like following orders then? Because I have one for you. Release me from these bonds. The Mandalorian suddenly stands up straight, walks over to Obi-Wan, and undoes the cuffs that had been restraining him. Obi-Wan then gets to his feet, brushes himself off for a moment, and looks at the Mandalorian and says, You will also give me your weapon. The Mandalorian then hands the rifle to Obi-Wan, right before the door to the cargo bay opens and two more blue and gray armored Mandalorians enter, see what's going on, and raise their blasters and start firing at him. Obi-Wan then dives behind one of the crates and looks at the rifle he's holding, frowns, and says something about how uncivilized it is. And his blaster bolts peg the crate he's hiding behind, and he hears the Mandalorian he mind-tricked say he doesn't know what happened and how he got his rifle, but he still has his blaster and that they should try and flank him. Obi-Wan glances around the cargo bay and sees the small wooden box sitting atop another crate not far from him. He then starts to make a hesitant move towards it, but a blaster bolt whizzes right past his head and he falls back behind his cover. We can then hear the Mandalorians moving about the hangar bay, continuing to fire as they do, and that's when Obi-Wan's face suddenly lights up with an idea. He reaches out his hand towards the box, and for a long moment, nothing happens. Finally, it begins to wobble before it quickly floats over to him. Obi-Wan then opens the box, sees the mask of Revan, and without hesitation, puts it on. He then immediately rises to his feet and extends his arm out, hand open, and his palm facing towards the three attackers, who instantly start firing on his new position. But their blaster bolts seem to bounce off some invisible force field, and after a few seconds of firing in vain, the three stop shooting, and it's at this moment that Obi-Wan rotates his hand, palm now facing up, and makes a fist. And as he does, all three Mandalorians are caught in a force choke and drop their weapons and start clutching at their throats. Obi-Wan then begins to raise his arm, and as he does, the three Mandalorians are lifted off their feet, and one by one, we hear some cracking and popping, and their bodies then go limp, before Obi-Wan releases his hold and lets them fall to the ground in a heap. And that is where this part ends. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you thought of this part of the story, and what you think might happen next. So leave a comment below, and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.